Brandy Schillace is here to celebrate with us the launch of her book, CLOCKWORK FUTURES, and she's going to talk about the science of steampunk. Brandy is a historian, author, and senior research associate for the Dittrick Museum of Medical History at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. Her recent books include Death's Summer Coat. This explores the cultural approaches to death and dying. It was published in 2015. And of course, CLOCKWORK Futures, which is the social history of technology and the steampunk aesthetics of invention, just published. In her endeavor, she seeks to uncover the human stories at the center of science and medicine, proving that truth is frequently stranger than fiction. So she's going to speak to us about her new book and the science of steampunk. So please welcome Brandy Schillace.
Thank you. I'm going to move the cord. I move around a lot when I talk. I used to teach class, and I used to tell them I was like, panthers at the zoo. They sort of watch you that way. I came all the way from Ohio, and that's interesting because there's a lot of astronauts from Ohio because there's something about Ohio that makes you want to leave Earth. But I really like. I'm in Cleveland. I love Cleveland. Cleveland is a great place. It's exactly like Brooklyn, except like 1/17 the size. So I want to talk a little bit today about CLOCKWORK Futures, and that's, is there a science of steampunk? Any steampunk fans out here? Yeah. Oh, good. Yeah. Sometimes I wear costumes. I didn't do it tonight. I know. But steampunk is kind of described as an aesthetic of sort of a Victorian-esque science future. So a lot of the other talks were talking about future histories, and I'm going to talk about past futures. Got it? Okay, yeah. So essentially, we've always had this love of the future. We want to know what the future is going to be like. That's been going on for a really long time. So if you're not familiar with the genre, I have a couple things to help you out. One, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Anybody read the book? Oh, good. Seen the movie? I was hoping you'd do. Everyone does that. If you've read the book, everybody's like, no, it's nothing like it. Infernal Devices, that's another good one. Whitechapel Gods. If you've not read Whitechapel Gods, that is what nightmares are made of. I really highly recommend it. You will never be the same. It will destroy your childhood as well. So why steampunk is my question, and why now? Why are we paying attention to this right now? Well, steampunk is about how technology advances us, but if you've paid any attention to any of these movies, it's also about how technology has a tendency to come back and haunt you a little bit. So I call this concept dread tech. Dread tech, right? Because we want it, we love it, we desire it, we don't want anyone else to have it, but we're also kind of frightened of it. Skynet is going to come back and get you. So how do we get there? This is actually just the first few lines of the book, and it's partly because I like stories, and this starts with a story. Every good history begins with a story. The best of them build bridges through time where one story's end is lost in the next one's beginning, like a dragon swallowing its own tail. This one has its origin in a small book on a high shelf that, through a series of accidents, turns out to be the key to a curious set of questions about humans and clockwork and power and steam and machines, particularly bodies and machines. You'll notice at the bottom here, I have the Red Queen. The Red Queen's fascinating in Through the Looking Glass because she says a memory's only really worth it if it works both ways, so that it's better if you can see the future and the past. I mean, I agree. None of us have that memory. So how do we get that? Well, steampunk offers us a way in because it's basically stories written today about the past dealing with a future that never actually happened. It's a fun playground. Or did it happen? And that's the real problem, isn't it? What I learned when I began researching, I work for a medical history museum, by the way, which is also what stuff of nightmares are made of. We have a basement of things. But what I learned is as I went back in time, well, it felt that way, to research the history of technology, things kept turning up that I thought, golly, that's a lot like actual steampunk that I've read. So this right here is the astrological clock of Prague. And I found it while in Prague because I was lost, which is one way to find things in Prague. It's the biggest thing there. It's gigantic. It's a great big automaton, essentially. When it strikes the hour, these little people come out and they do things, and Death turns up and rings his bell at you. And it's a really unnerving. More unnerving for me, because when I was a child, my parents took me to the biggest cuckoo clock in the world, which is in Ohio. That's right. And they were really excited. They thought I'd love it. I'm 3, so I'm a wee person. And the clock strikes, and all of a sudden these little wooden people come out. And their faces don't move, but they sing, and they've got these little wooden faces, and they're playing instruments. I was terrified. They're bigger than me. I'm 3. It was absolutely horrifying, and I used to have nightmares about these things coming to get me. So I think the concept that clockwork or automatons are going to replace humans is something that still affects us today. And way back in 1410, by the way, this was when the sun went around the Earth. Maybe you've noticed. Back then when it did that. We had this concept that if we just discovered what the clockwork of the universe was like, all that chaos would go away. Because the world was chaotic and we wanted to impose a kind of order. And we wanted to impose that order on human bodies too, which would be awesome in medicine if you could just make things clockwork. You know, like women's bodies particularly. One of the areas I spend a lot of my time studying is reproduction in the 18th century. And you didn't really want to reproduce in the 18th century if you could keep from it. But they didn't have a real clear understanding of what human bodies were like. And yeah, that's a good one, isn't it? Women delivered babies originally, which made sense. But then men decided that since that was medicine, women shouldn't be able to do it anymore. Just FYI, they also thought that if you were a woman and you read too much, all the blood would go from your ovaries into your brain, and you wouldn't be able to have babies. Which isn't true, or we would all read a lot more. Saying. So, they wanted to take this away from women. They were going to practice instead. They used something called forceps, which looked like salad tongs, and they got them in there in the vaginal canal to pull out babies, but they're not allowed to look because that's inappropriate. So they do this under a sheet. Right, you're going to put those in there under a sheet. Just keep that in mind. It didn't go well, and they started calling it Dr. Blowbladder's Art of Touching for reasons. So someone came along with the idea that we could get a lot better practice if we built a better woman, because that makes sense. So the female machine, the woman machine, is something that was built to try and train male doctors how to give birth, basically how to use these forceps and pull babies out. And it had levers, contracting uterus. It had flexible skin, flexible joints, shoes, stockings, liquid-filled, or he filled bags of beer and put them on the inside. Because then he'd know if you punctured one. You'd be like, you killed your lady patient. It also didn't have a head. So it was a perfect 18th century woman, gave birth once an hour, no head. These get made well into the 19th century. Here's one. You might think to yourself, that looks like a sex doll. I thought that too. No, that's medicine, friends. Just medicine, nothing to see here. But essentially, what this meant was people were trying to build better bodies than the bodies we already had. And so I really appreciate the discussion of the spacesuits, because it seems like if only we had big, round, spherical bodies, right? If only there was some way that the human body could accommodate. But this is the funny thing about technology. We accommodate to technology a lot more often than technology accommodates to us. And if you don't believe me, think about the last conversation you had with Siri. Right? We are learning to talk differently, aren't we? Siri, where car? Where car now? One of my friends asked Siri what to do with a dead body, and she asked if there were any large bodies of water nearby, and I thought, that disturbs me on many levels. So in addition to technology trying to beat off chaos, we wanted to use technology to infuse order into our lives. Technology has also been used to stave off darkness. So the book is separated into these sections which kind of tell you a little bit about these polar opposites that are always competing. So light and darkness. This is an image of the Davy arc light. Humphrey Davy, anybody know who he is? No? Oh, okay, well, wait, he's great. He's also the guy that discovered laughing gas and did not use it for any medical purposes, but took it to parties. He's that guy. He would love tonight. He'd be hanging out with you guys. So anyway, he creates the arc light, But the story behind the arc light, that's the science, is more disturbing. How do we get to the arc light? How do we get to light? Well, it often starts in the darkness. Galvani was a man who believed in animal electricity. He touched some wires to some dead frogs' legs, and they twitched a little bit. And he decided that what was happening is that electricity that lived in the frog was released by the metal that he touched it with, not that the metal caused it. Alessandro Volta went, I don't think so. They have a big fight. And they had these competing, so many frogs died in this fight, you guys. They had all of these competing experiments to prove, Alessandro Volta saying, no, electricity is a thing, you touched muscles, that's what happened. And Galvani saying, no, it's in the body already. And this really ultimately ends in Volta, that should sound familiar, creating the first battery, which are stacks of metal and acid and various things. And then Humphrey Davy going, what if we got a shit ton of these things and put them in a basement? And so that's what he did. He giant stacks, many voltaic piles that he then uses. He shuts all the lights off, and he does that, essentially. This is a recreation of this in Cincinnati, where they basically wanted to see what it would have been like to launch this on a... Remember, there's no electricity yet. Nobody's seen any of this happen. You just turn up and go, hi, I'm God, and you just make arc light happen. Davy's the one who gave himself a family crest, and it reads, I bring the light that makes safety, or something like that. So he's a bit full of himself. So light, it sounds like a great idea, but Galvani's career is ruined. And his nephew, Aldini, decides he's going to fix his career by proving once and for all that animal electricity exists. And what he does is he gets a dead body, a corpse that had been hanged recently, and he decides to put a bunch of volts through its anus. And the thing is, if you do that to a dead body, it does things like sit straight up, and nobody wants to see that. So people just run screaming. I mean, it's terrible. He does this in a big public square, by the way, outside, and there's just a body suddenly sitting up and frothing at the mouth and all kinds of bizarre things. A long time ago. You'll have to read the book. This is a while back. This is around, actually. Well, let me put it this way. It influenced a young lady. Mary Shelley, yeah, who wrote Frankenstein in the early 18 teens. And so she was a young girl when this experiment was done. And so if you're wondering, where in the world would a little girl get that idea? Now you know. But that light and darkness didn't only concern actual electricity. They were also trying to bring light to dark places in the world. They were into exploration. They wanted to discover Africa, the dark continent. They took ships up to the north. They wanted to see for themselves the paradise that was at the poles. They thought there was a paradise at the poles. How else would you get people to go on these ships? Like, hey guys, it's Eden, I'm sure of it. It actually is more like that. There's a lot of frozen shipwrecks that, because of climate change, are suddenly turning up again out there in the wilds. But essentially, we fight against the darkness by trying to bring light, and again, we see this playing out that each time you try, you ultimately end up bringing something else into the mix. I like to talk about it as a twin birth. Out of technology, we get things like heart transplants. Also out of technology, we get things like atom bombs. The twin birth is always there. Industry and anarchy are a couple of other chapters that talk about privation in industry versus anarchy and control. We like industry, right? We're built on industry. But as the first presentation describes, that's getting us into a whole lot of trouble as well. Not just environmentally, but the social consequences. In the 19th century, they were terrified by what industry was doing to their minds. People thought you'd go insane if you rode on a train because it went so fast. Now today, we fly in airplanes that travel at unimaginable speeds. But Paul Virilio, who is a theorist of accidents, says every invention is also its own perilous accident. Everything we come up with can potentially destroy us. That is not a real thing. That is. This is a carbolic acid sprayer. It sits in the museum that I work in. The other one is an acid gun created for a steampunk convention. But both of them are really dealing with something that is, in fact, phenomenally real. That's acid Carbolic acid was the first thing we used to kill germs so that you didn't die from infection and have to have your leg amputated. We have a bunch of amputation sets at the museum, too. They're big sellers. I'm very popular among 9-year-olds. But it could save your life. It could also damage it irreparably. The Le Petit Journal there is about acid throwing. And if you're paying attention to the news, this is happening again. People using vitriolic acid to throw at people, sometimes for revenge purposes, sometimes in hate crimes, particularly in the uprisings of people who are working in factories over long hours. They would go after people that they themselves felt oppressed by. And it also turns up in Sherlock Holmes. And in The Illustrious Client, Kitty Winters takes some acid to the man who wronged her. So we have this concept that you have something good. Acid can be used in batteries. It can be used to protect you from infection. And something bad. It can be used to disfigure you. It can kill you. And it's pretty useful in forensic science, too. The very last thing that I like to talk about is death versus immortality. I have kind of a death thing going on. My last book was on death and dying in America. And my book before that was an academic book on birth, so I will get you coming or going. And in between, there's forensics. Oh, that's really after death, I guess. So I do birth, death, and after you die, we'll find out who did it. So it's quite popular in Hollywood, right? We see movies. We love watching that stuff on TV. That's stuff from our basement in the museum. All of the things that you see that seem like they couldn't possibly be there, couldn't possibly be real, most of the time they are, even down to the colored lenses that people used, partly because things blew up a lot in the lab. Right there, those are some slides from John George Spencer collection. He was a forensic toxicologist in Cleveland. And he was remarkable. He graduated with his degree at the age of 16, his medical degree. They wouldn't give it to him because they were like, fuck no, you're 16. So he went on and got a PhD instead in Germany, in German. He shows back up in Cleveland, Ohio, sets up shop, creates letterhead that just says expert at the top, just generally an expert. I kept thinking, gosh, that guy reminds me of Sherlock Holmes. And apparently he thought so too, because he puts a whole lot of Sherlock Holmes paraphernalia in his notebooks. So it comes down in a way to life. This is an automaton. This is the writing boy in Neuchâtel, Switzerland. And he was basically the first computer. All of those components fit in his little body, and he could be programmed to sit down and write sentences. Death. That's an image from Death's Summer Coat of the decorated skeletons in Italy. That right there is memento mori. People used to take pictures of the dead because you might not have pictures of them living. And immortality, because let's face it, Sherlock Holmes is still alive, isn't he? He's never going away, you realize. He's going to be here long after we're all gone. We long for the things that change us. We long for the things that bring us more life, that bring us technological advances, that extend our life, extend our reach, extend our ability to live on other planets. At the same time, these kinds of things can bring in concepts of death. A book like Frankenstein thought it was seeing the future, a future of potentially reanimated bodies. Various steampunk thrillers, we've got everything from Jules Verne to H.G. Wells. The future tantalizes, but somehow always seems to threaten us with something worse. So Paul Virilio, he's a theorist of accidents. Did you know there was a theorist of accidents? Isn't that great? He's French, I think that's why. So he says, dread tech. Basically, at the same time they invented the railway, they invented the railway crash. If you invent the airplane, you've also invented the airplane crash. Technology requires you to accept it on its terms. In other words, if we create a technology and it only works a certain way, if you give it a certain input, then you have to keep giving it that input or else it stops working. That means you acclimate yourself to the machine rather than the machine acclimating to you. So we have to think about the substance and the consequence. We have to think about the things that are both charming and fascinating and silly and fundamental about science. But we also have to think about what that could mean for our future. This is a picture of Tesla in his laboratory. It's wonderful because it's a fiction that Tesla himself made. He did not sit there while that was running. This is a double exposed photograph. I love Tesla. You have to admit, he's all like, I got an idea, guys. Those are two photographs that are superimposed on one another, and he passed them off as though he was really sitting there. But Tesla's interesting because he keeps turning up in fiction in other ways, too. There's a steampunk graphic novel called The Five Fists of Science, and in it, Mark Twain and Tesla team up, and Mark Twain convinces Tesla to make giant robots that he will sell to all the countries, and once all the countries have giant robots, there will be no more war. Right? Worked with nuclear weapons. So it's a very, very silly book until you find out that Mark Twain and Tesla were actually friends, and that Tesla is the person who invented the remote control boat that could shoot torpedoes with commands, and that the military laughed at Tesla and said, nobody's ever going to want unmanned attack vessels. How silly. And Mark Twain said, you know, you could make one of these for every country, and then there would be no more war. Fiction, futures, they have a funny way of not always being fiction. And I think that they can tell us a lot today. What I usually tell people when they come to the museum is come away with two separate ideas in your head. One, be really grateful that you weren't sick in 1810. And two, remember that we always bring our own preconceived notions, our own desires, and our own dread to every new endeavor of technology that we have today. And we have an ethical responsibility to consider those consequences. I also recommend that you read a lot more fiction, because it's in fiction, steampunk fictions, Sherlock Holmes fictions, that we most often see played out the brand new ideas that we have for technology, but that maybe as technology theorists we haven't thought through the consequences. Chances are a fiction writer out there has. Thank you.
Any questions for Brandy?
No questions. Oh dear.
Anyone?
Wow, I'm like totally intimidating. I'm really not. Yeah.
There you go. All right.
So you started with this slide with this order from chaos, right? And then I see in many of the slides you're using this kind of foreground, background, or parallelism between concepts. Is there like a general theme that you're kind of thinking through as you're designing this slide?
Yeah, partly it comes back to that idea of desire and dread. I think that it's nice to think of yourself as a child again and remember the things that you most wanted, you know, that you most wanted to see that movie, but then that night you might have a dream about it and it's a nightmare and it's terrifying. Desire and dread are really wrapped up together, and so while dichotomies are often don't always leave as much gray area as there really exist in real life, I do think that there's a kind of good-bad parallel that we often come up with. We'll like to say, oh, this character was good in history and this character was bad. This is the supervillain and this is the hero. Life is much more complicated than that. But at the same time, I think we retain, just like when we were kids, that concept that light is good and that darkness is bad. And so each chapter kind of plays with that. Is there really a good side here, or is it muddier than that in the middle?
Who are some of your favorite fiction writers who've dealt with these topics?
You know what? I'm a big fan of Mary Shelley, I have to say. 200-year anniversary next year, by the way. Did you know that the first head transplant? Yes, the first head transplant of a primate was done in Cleveland. I was very proud to find that out. Dr. White put a monkey's head on another monkey, and it worked. He wasn't very pleased, but... So I love Mary Shelley. I actually tend to read a lot of Victorian fiction myself. So one of my interests in steampunk is more reading the actual fictions of the time period. Jules Verne is fascinating. And if you haven't read it, not as well known, he wrote a book called Paris in the 20th Century. It's just about his only dystopian novel. And he talks about how there will be these machines of war that will replace people. and that everyone will have technology that does like 6 or 7 different things. Like a bed will turn into a piano, will turn into a dinner table, will turn into a toilet. And that really, I'm not exaggerating. And that somehow the humanities won't be considered important anymore. That in fact, science will be all there is. And instead of poetry, you'll just have strings of numbers written together. And he sent it to his publisher. It was the first book he wrote, and his full book. And his publisher said, we can't publish that. That's just too far out. No one would ever believe that. No one's going to believe that technology replacing the humanities. But in fact, it didn't get published until the 80s or 90s. Like it was way later, well after that. And it's one of my favorites, actually. So Jules Verne's another good one.
When did steampunk become a word? And also, what's punk about steampunk?
That's a fascinating. No, it's good. It's true. I looked into this, and I think Jeter, W.K. Jeter, might be the first person who actually puts that together as a word, steampunk. But what the book basically says, and this is getting into some of the other themes in the book, is that if steampunk is about kind of punkifying science, about making it sort of like a carnival tent and exciting and sexy, that steam power could be made sexy, then science has always been doing this because science has had to sell itself every single time. People tend not to just buy in. You know, you have to turn up and be your own carnival barker, in fact. And some people in science were really good at this. Edison was great at this. He was very good about the whiz and the bang. And Tesla was very good at this as well. And so you have a lot of situations where if you want people to accept the science, you have to get out and do your dog and pony show. And if steampunk is an aesthetic that is about top hats and corsets and flashing lights and steam engines and all this wonderful stuff, all the really differentiated technologies, and they've all got brass buttons and they're interesting to look at, in a way that's selling science in the same kind of sense. I don't know why he chose punk, but now there's diesel punk as well, if you're not familiar. So if steam's not your thing, there's more. All right, thank you very much.